Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 154. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with award-winning author Gale Massey. Her latest book is titled Rising and Other Stories. This short story collection was 10 years in the making. These stories represent Gale's learning curve and demonstrate how her confidence as a writer has grown over the years. It wasn't until after curating this collection that she realized her stories shared several themes in common: nature, water, grief, and the notion of women, especially girls, taking on the world. This latter theme is also present in Gale's first novel, The Girl from Blind River, a coming-of-age story about a young girl finding her way through adolescence to the brink of adulthood, where she can finally make her own decisions. In this episode, I'll chat with Gale about her writing journey, how learning to play poker was the spark she needed to write her first novel, and why she believes The Girl from Blind River is the story she was born to write, as well as a few other things coming up. Gale Massey, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your newest book, Rising and Other Stories. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this collection and what inspired you to write it.
So this collection was written over about 10 years. It represents sort of my learning curve as a writer. Some of the stories in here are 10 or so years old, and some of them I've written along the way. And then there are 3 or 4 in here that I just wrote just to round out the collection. So they sort of mark my development as a writer from the very early stages of taking myself seriously as a writer and starting to go to workshops and taking these stories to workshops, and then just developing and getting a little more proficient as a writer. So it's sort of like an accounting of my growth as a writer, from not having written very much to having written several novels now and a collection of short stories.
And I'm curious how you approach the curation of a collection like this. You said that these stories have been written, some as old as 10 years ago, some brand new. Did you have a goal in mind when you were putting these stories together? Or did the goal or the message reveal itself to you once you had collected them all?
I think it was revealed as I and my editor started putting these together. A certain theme came out, a couple of themes. There's a lot of writing about nature and in particular water. And as we put the collection together, it also seemed to me that it's mainly about girls against the world. It's a lot about girls starting in a one down position and rising to their full potential or more potential as they figure out how to operate and navigate the world, which is, there's a lot of unfair qualities happening to these girls in these stories. And I found through collecting them and putting them all together that that's really a very important theme for me as a writer, is a writerly value, as they say, is talking about girls in the position, in the one down position, having to figure out the world.
Let's talk about some of the stories in the collection. Did you have favorites among them, or were there ones that were very enjoyable to write, easy to write? Were there others that you struggled with? Tell us a bit about some of the stories and your thoughts on them now, looking back on the collection.
There were a couple of stories that I struggled with that didn't make it into the collection because the struggle, I couldn't make sense of that story. But since it's come out, I do have a couple of favorites. The second one is called Differences. Differences is one of my favorites, and I've had a lot of people respond to that. I think I enjoyed writing it so much because there was, the main event that happens in that story surprised me. And I was just taken aback and I was amused, that I had written something that was turned out to be quite so dark. That actually surprised me. It wasn't anything I planned. And a lot of people have responded to me about that story. It's one of the first ones anybody talks about when they get back to me after having read it. So there's that one. And then there's also one called Freedom's Just Another Word. Now, this isn't about a girl, but it's about Toby Elders, who's a young gay man who is just coming to terms to his own realization about his sexual orientation. So I like that story a lot because it explores what it's like to be gay and oppressed and in the closet and not really having the space and freedom to explore your own orientation and being surprised by it when it reveals itself to you very personally.
And it's interesting that you mentioned surprises because you've had these stories developing over 10 years and you've gathered them together. And you said themes were revealing themselves as you did so. And you had surprises from the stories themselves as you wrote, surprises from your readers. Did that strike you as unusual that there would be so many surprises as you've embarked on collecting these stories and putting them together? Were you expecting that? Is that something you have come to expect as a writer, or does it still catch you off guard when it happens?
Well, this is my only collection, but I was really surprised. I thought that I would be collecting these stories from the past decade and I would put them together and some order would come of it, but I didn't realize that there would be so many themes of water. Just looking at the contents title, there's low tide, there's swim away, there's ivy waters. Even in Lucky Girl, there's just so much water running through the book that I didn't notice it until my editor started working on the cover. And she said, "There's so much water here. We're going to do a painting of your favorite river." And that's where the cover came from. And there was another theme that popped out too, and that was about grief. And a lot of these characters are dealing with grief in some form or fashion. And I didn't quite realize that I had written that much about grief, but obviously it's something that intrigues me, intrigues a lot of humans because it's a universal experience. And then the other obvious theme is that these are almost all stories about girls who are being raised or were raised in poverty and what it's like to come of age in our society as a girl. It's already complicated. And then as an impoverished girl, what more it takes for a girl to arrive safely as a young adult in the way we view and raise our daughters. So there were three themes that came out that sort of surprised me: the girl against the world theme, the grief theme, and so much water flowing through the book.
And were these themes you were writing about 10 years ago, same as today?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. All the things, yes, all of these stories that I can look back and say, I can identify what year I wrote them in. The themes are definitely consistent all the way through.
Have you noticed differences in your writing from the stories you wrote 10 years ago to the new ones you wrote to round out the collection? Do you approach your writing differently? Do you notice different changes in your style?
I think it's definitely writing has gotten easier for me over the years. And I'm a little more comfortable with putting in wider swings of action. And I'm more comfortable writing a short story because I kind of know now how to get to the point, and that it needs a point. And I think that it's just a little bit more fun because over the years, right, I've developed more skill. I don't have the apprehension that I used to have when I sat down to write. I've got a lot more confidence, and I think that shows in some of the later stories. They move quicker and they have larger swings of action in them.
I'd like to talk about the novel you wrote, the book that came out prior to Rising and Other Stories. That book is called The Girl from Blind River. If you don't mind, tell us about that book.
Oh, that book is so much a part of my heart. I started writing that book a couple of years after I started attending conferences, and I had the idea for it because I was learning how to play poker at the time, and I was meeting all of these interesting women who play poker, and I thought it just occurred to me that it would be a great vehicle to tell the story of a young girl, that poker would give me the legs, that the novel needs to go the distance. But I love this book because it has a young girl who has a learning disability, whose only real skill that she can identify for herself is that she's a bit of a savant when it comes to playing poker. But she comes from a family of crime. She comes from an impoverished situation. She's failed out of college, and she has just one way of seeing her future. And of course, then things get very complicated, and the small town she's in tries to drag her down, and her family needs to keep her, in their service. But eventually, she finds her way through. The whole book is about her finding her way through this mess of her life in order to get to the brink of adulthood where she can start making her own choices and aim her life in the direction she wants. So it's a book that's very near and dear to my heart. I love it. It might be the book that I was born to write, as they say.
Well, let's talk about your main character, Jamie. How did you strike upon her? Did she find you when you were thinking about this story? Did you hear her voice? Did you see her clearly from the start? Or was this something you created to fit the story that you wanted to tell?
Definitely saw Jamie sitting across the table from me one afternoon when I was playing a poker tournament. This young woman couldn't have been more than 20, and she was an amazing poker player. And the question that came to me and the question that drove the story was, how does someone that young become such a proficient poker player? And to answer that question, I had to investigate Jamie's family of origin. I had to investigate the town that she grew up in. I had to understand who taught her how to play poker and why. So the novel came from all of those questions, but the original question is, how does someone that young become such a great poker player? And I think that good novels start with a question that the novelist has to answer for herself.
Did you know that this novel was going to be a thriller, that it was going to have that mystery element to it when you set out to write it, or is that just how the story evolved for you?
I didn't know that it was going to have thriller aspects. And so that came along after quite a lot of pages, maybe 100 pages. I realized that there needed to be another element in the story to really give it energy. So that evolved out of the writing of it.
Paint a picture for us of the setting of this book. I get the impression that the setting for you was important to demonstrate the sort of direness of this character's position, the danger that she was in, and where she teetered on the brink of adulthood. Describe Blind River for us.
So Blind River is a small town in the Hudson River Valley in New York. And the very, very first images that came to me as I was writing the first page, the first scene, was of cold and deprivation. I had in my mind icicles, crunchy snow. I knew that that was important to honor that. If that was what was coming through in the writing process, I wanted to stay with that because that was the opening the door to the novel. And in terms of keeping Jamie cold, she's always seeking her way out of the ice and snow. There's no hot water in the trailer where she's been raised. She goes to another friend's house to take a hot shower. She's often walking through the streets in sleet and ice. She's seeking comfort. And I felt like that was just so much a part of who she was and the situation she found herself in. There's a diner on Main Street in Blind River, which is a fictitious town. There's not really one. There's one in Canada, but it's I've never been there. I have no idea what that place is like. This was a town I built in my head. So it's a small town. There's a fertilizer plant that's half shut down. Most of the men in town work there. They wear blue work shirts. They drive pickup trucks. There's a lot of rust and chain link fences in the novel. So it was a story about putting this girl in a difficult situation where she's seeking her way forward, and she's actually just seeking shelter from the elements.
Your book, as well as your short stories, a lot of them tend to center around this idea of defining moments or consequences that flow from a decision made or an action taken, even if that decision or action seems small at the time. Is that something that you focus on when you start a story? Is that a conscious decision to delve into those kinds of situations? Or do you find, like some of the themes in your short stories, that it just tends to come up in your writing once you look back on it?
I think that almost all of the stories or novels I've written, it just comes up. I trust that it's going to come up. I think I focus mainly on character, and I do honestly believe that if you wait long enough with a character, they're going to show you the trouble they just stumbled into. I think it's just human nature, and it's definitely the nature of my characters to reveal themselves to me, and then pretty much if I just stick with that character for a page or two, or even sometimes three, the trouble they're in or the trouble they get themselves in is going to just come up intuitively, naturally. It's just going to be there. And then I'll be able to work off of that.
Do you have a preference for the form of your writing? Do you prefer the novel form? Do you prefer the short story? Now that you've done both, What do you want to do more of?
Well, I just finished writing the first draft of a novel and I loved it. I wore myself out getting through that first draft, just so fast. And then I just love being inside a novel that has the bones, and I'm going to put some flesh on the bones. That's like a beautiful place for me to just dwell. So I do love that part. But I also have to say, I kind of love writing a short story because it's such a less of a commitment. It just, when you start writing a novel, you have this, this like trepidation, like, can I really write this novel? Does it have legs? Can it go the distance? Do I have the energy for it? When you approach a short story, you know, you're going to write 10 or 20 pages, you can do it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have a wish list for the rest of your writing journey? You've just completed a draft of a novel, but do you have a wish list either of books or stories you want to write or things that you want to do as an author?
I do. I've got two novels that have not found homes yet. So, I certainly want to find homes for them. I'd really like to see The Girl from Blind River make its way to and through Hollywood. That's like a very big pipe dream, but and then after that, I actually do want to just study another form. I'd like to write more essays, more personal essays about what it's like to be a writer and yeah. So the essay collection is that's actually something I've been working on over the last few years too. It needs a lot more work, but it's out there waiting for me.
When did you start writing? You mentioned that the short story collection represented your learning curve as a writer over the last 10 years, but what made you start writing? And is this something you've always wanted to do?
It is something I've always wanted to do. I started writing poetry as a teenager, and then through my 20s, I journaled a lot. But I didn't really have the kind of self confidence I thought to take myself very seriously. And then I wrote a little booklet. It's sort of a primer on grief, how to get through grief. And it was so well received that it opened the door for me to take myself a little bit seriously as a writer. And then that's when I started going to workshops and conferences. And when you go to workshops and conferences, you're going to find people who will tell you, well, you have a little bit of something there. You have a little bit of talent. What you need to do is work on this skill. And so I got enough encouragement to start taking fiction seriously.
At what point in that journey did you consider yourself a writer? Was that from the very beginning or did that happen later?
That happened later for me. I'm not even sure I thought of myself as a writer, even when The Girl from Blind River was published. I could still tell myself at that point that it was a fluke, you know. But since then, I've been published on a lot of different places, short stories and essays, and of course the collection. So now I really get that I am a writer, and I'm okay with saying that to myself. But it took a long time for me to get to that place.
What is the best part of this writing journey for you?
The best part is hands down being lost inside a story. That's that's the magic and that's the joy. And there's a lot of angst that comes with being a writer, and a lot of angst as you start getting published, because I am, and most writers are such introverts that crossing the threshold from being by yourself and writing a story into other people reading it and having opinions about it and being more in the public, that's just quite a abrupt sort of change. But when I am inside a story and I'm writing it, that feels like my purpose. It feels like what I came here to do, what I came to this life to do. And I'm not aware of, the outside world when I'm writing. And that's the small but powerful joy I get from writing.
Well, if people are interested in learning more about you and your books, finding out about new releases or things that you're doing, where should they go to find you and that information?
My website is a good place to find me. You can even contact me through it. It's galemassey.com. So all of my books are listed there in places where you can buy them. And some of my essays are listed there if you want to read some things that I've written. Galemassey.com. Come visit me.
Good. Well, Gale, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with Rising and Other Stories and your works in progress. Good luck with those. So congratulations on everything you have accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for talking with me today. I felt like we got to some good things today, so thank you.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.